Hey, well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we're really pleased to have with us today Will Dean. His brand new book is called The Chamber. Here's the US edition. Um, and we also have a very limited number of signed copies of the British edition, which is a hardcover. And I'll put links to both of them in the comments field. And if you have any questions for Will, go ahead and type those in, and Barbara will bring me back on screen towards the end of the hour, and I would be happy to ask any questions that you might have. So, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. It's lovely to see you, Will. It's been what, 2 months since we were together in London?
It's lovely to see you, Barbara. Yeah, we had a great time in Capital Crime in London.
We did. In fact, we went to the band, Val McDermott on vocal and Mark Billingham and other authors. And, it was really fun. It was a great way to end that conference Saturday night. So Will was sort of he was kindly my escort. Which was great, right? And we
It was so
ran
much.
it was. Remember John Connolly? There was a whole thing about throwing out some guy that tried to crash the van. Do you remember that?
There was some misunderstanding at the bar, and I love the way that the whole kind of crime writing community came together to look after John. Not that he needs any looking after. And David Headley was very protective.
It
I
was.
remember the owner of Goldsboro Books. It was very nice to see everybody just being on the same team.
It was. No, it was absolutely wonderful. And you're right, John doesn't actually need anybody to protect him, but still, it was great to see him. It was actually great to see everybody. I really enjoyed dinner with Ian Rankin, one of my oldest friends in the book world. And, we had a chance to sneak out for dinner and got to meet Janice Hallett for the first time, even though your same publisher. I've done all of her US launches, but had never met her. So it was sort of weird, I was hoping I'd recognize her, when I met her for tea. I thought this is going to be so embarrassing if I come into the room and I don't know, I can't figure out who she is. But luckily, there she was. Right. So, anyway, Capital Crime, for those who are interested, is a gathering in London. It'll be meeting in mid-June in 2025. And the hotel is located right next to St. Paul's Cathedral and also by the Millennial Bridge. So, it's a terrific place to, walk to the Thames, walk to the cathedral, walk down is it Ludgate Hill? That's what it is, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, you can't. I don't think you can get a better location. Just
Oh,
literally in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral. It's incredible.
it really is. I walked around the outside of the cathedral and the gardens right before they closed one night, and I have to say it was really magical with the light, you know, um, coming through, and the roses were in bloom and all the I mean, it was one of those quintessentially British moments, that I thought was outstanding. However, I will say that when I walked out on the Millennial Bridge and looked down towards the Tower of London, it's no longer visible because of all the high rises that are being built along the river. Did you do that? Do you find that a little weird?
I do, yeah, especially as we left London for Sweden 12 years ago. And even since then, the number of skyscrapers, not by New York standards, but by British standards, European standards, is quite shocking. And you have, like you say, you have all these historic gems, these cathedrals and abbeys and really special buildings dating back to Roman times, and you can hardly see them anymore.
That's very true. I hope they're still being maintained. And just to complete this little London travelogue, I met a friend at the new restaurant, which is on top of Royal Covent Garden Opera House. And it has a beautiful view over Covent Garden, but Covent Garden doesn't look like it used to. It now has a fancy glass roof. It's kind of like a conservatory and ads for all kinds of stuff on it. And it's become incredibly chic. Whereas when I first went to London, gosh, when I was a child, it was pretty grungy.
Yep, so true. I mean, I remember being in London 25 years ago, a university, and Soho felt dangerous and noirish. It felt like you were in a novel, in a spy novel, walking down one street, and then in a gritty crime novel, walking down another street. And now it's quite corporate, and it's the same stores as everywhere else. It's really changed a lot.
He's right. There's an analogy there to Boston, and I'm trying to remember the name of the famous market in Boston. But it's the same thing. It's gone, I think there's one in Milan too. There's a whole glorious kind of a arcade, shops and the whole bit, all glassed over. Who loves it? Anyway, Will, as he's indicated to you, lives in Sweden in the woods. I love it. And he comes out once a year to go on tour. But now he's back home in the woods in Sweden, which is why we were talking to you at noon in Arizona and 9 o'clock. But you can see that in the summer, it's still pretty light right there in Sweden, isn't it?
It is. It's still light outside. I can walk Bernie, my St. Bernard, until right now until kind of 11 o'clock, and it's still fine.
Wonderful. So what inspired you to write a standalone thriller, which is basically a locked room mystery and I can't remember ever reading another locked room mystery in exactly this setting. So take it away and tell us all about it.
So The Chamber it's kind of the extreme locked room thriller. It's And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie meets The Last Breath from Netflix. So it's just the most claustrophobic, awful setting I could ever imagine. And I think often I get an idea for a book as I'm falling asleep in that strange time between wakefulness and sleep. And I know it's a good idea if I kind of sit bolt upright and it has my attention and I want to know more. And I'll write some notes that night. And then the next day, often I read the notes and it makes no sense and it's going nowhere. But occasionally one will stick. And that was The Chamber. So I kind of saw in my mind's eye this hatch, kind of like you see on the cover. But I didn't see a hand at the glass. I saw a face, a woman's face. And I could just tell by her eyes, yeah, it's a really sinister cover. I could tell by her eyes just that she was extremely competent in her job and calm, but also terrified and could not walk away from a bad situation. And I'm not particularly claustrophobic, but I do appreciate the ability to walk away. And in this situation, in this hyperbaric chamber, I'll set the scene for readers. So imagine you're on a ship in the middle of the North Sea, a commercial diving vessel, and you go down below deck and there's a gleaming stainless steel saturation chamber the size of a minibus. And the hatch is open and you slither through this little opening and the hatch is locked behind you. And inside there are 5 other divers already there and bunks hanging from the ceiling. It's very, very close. You can't really move past each other very well. And the nitrogen starts to get purged out of the chamber and replaced by helium. So everyone's voices start to go very high and it gets very hot and very close because you're breathing gas, not air anymore. And then the next morning you wake up and you transfer through to an even smaller chamber, a diving bell, you and another diver, and you go down through the bottom of the ship down to the seabed, 350 feet below. And as you go deeper and deeper and deeper, you can feel the pressure. You can hear the creaks and you can feel the pressure change. And you have to pinch your nose to equalize. And when you get down to the seabed, you look through the little porthole window and it's dark outside because you're so deep. And then your diving companion puts your helmet on because it weighs 20 kilos. You can't do it yourself. And it crushes down onto your neck and you're even more claustrophobic. And then to equalize now, you can't pinch your nose anymore. So you have to kind of push your face into the front of the helmet. It's so uncomfortable. And this is all before A, you start work, you start your shift out in the water, and B, before the first murder.
Yes, I was the whole time I was reading this book, I'm not claustrophobic either, but for one thing, I can't imagine being that close to 5 other people relentlessly. And, you already know that hygiene has to be right. And you think, if you read about space travel and you try to figure out, how they do waste disposal, because anybody do laundry, can anybody have a shower? I mean, what do you do? Because basically we're all kind of smelly animals and when we're all crunched together. Do they have to learn to tolerate other people's odors in order to do this?
That's a great question. So I think the saturation diving community is such a small group of people around the world. There are only a few dozen new saturation divers welcomed in every year. They're right at the apex of the commercial diving world. And they all have to get all of their qualifications, but they also have to be accepted within the group. Someone has to vouch for them. And part of that is that they stay very calm and they're very practical and they don't buckle under pressure, if you'll excuse the pun, but also that they have good personal hygiene. They look after themselves. They don't get on other people's nerves because they're stuck in this chamber for 28 days at a time. And they can't open that hatch. They're there for 28 days. There are 100 people on the ship, and their job is just to keep those 6 divers alive for 28 days. And so they can't have those bad habits. They need to be showering regularly. They need to be quiet when everyone else is sleeping. It's really interesting, that dynamic of not getting on each other's nerves, because there's no way to vent. There's no way you can walk away. So you have to stay calm and you have to be sympathetic to the people around you at all times.
So now I will now incite a sexist, trope here, but are there women, there is one in this book, but are there women with any frequency? And if so, how old are they? Because the one function I can't imagine they could maintain, would be that thing for young women who come into puberty and then age out of it. I don't see how you could manage that.
Another great question. So there are a handful of women who do this around the world. There's one very, very well-known case in the Gulf of Mexico. She was a saturation diver. She was probably the first person to break that glass ceiling. Up until that point, you had incredibly competent female saturation divers, female commercial divers who weren't diving sat. And she was the first person, because she was so competent and calm and professional and strong and had great endurance and technical prowess. She was kind of undeniably a great diver, so they had to accept her in. She was the first person, and she's famous for bringing in other women behind her. And I was inspired by her actually with Ellen Brooke, the protagonist of the book. She's at the beginning, she's filming to try and persuade other women to join her ranks and to try to be a saturation diver. But yeah, they just have to be kind of practical. I think it's similar to being in the military. So Ellen, when she showers, she kind of rigs up a towel so she has some privacy, because pretty much everybody outside the chamber is male. So she has to be careful to protect her privacy whilst also not seeming difficult. Right. And that's a constant challenge.
So tell us what saturation diver is. You use the term, but I don't know that everybody watching this really knows what it means.
So it's you have different levels of diving. You have scuba, and then you have commercial diving, which often involves an umbilical. So you're breathing, and you get hot water, and you get electricity for your hat lamp through an umbilical. So you're always attached to something, either a diving bell or a ship. And with saturation diving, it basically means that your bodily tissues are saturated with helium. So a mixture of helium and oxygen. So you no longer have nitrogen, the cause of the bends in your soft tissues. So that's where the term saturation comes from. It basically means you're diving, breathing gas instead of air. And it's really taxing for your physiology. So long term, a lot of saturation divers say they have bubble brain. So they have memory loss, or they have various different symptoms affecting their eyesight or their sinuses, because they have done so many saturation dives. So in a year, they might do 4 or 5 28-day shifts at the same pressure as the seabed. So in the chamber, it's 100 meters depth, but sometimes it's more than 200 meters depth. So that means they'll have an 8-day decompression. So basically, if something goes wrong on a dive like that, they can't open the hatch for 8 days.
Okay. Well, yeah. What is it that they're doing? I mean, what is the point of being a saturation diver? There has to be some reason you're on the seabed.
Yes. So these guys maintain the oil infrastructure of the world. So the pipelines that run all the way along the seabed in the Gulf of Mexico and in the North Sea, but also in the Caspian Sea, off the coast of India and Australia. These pipelines are 300 to 600 feet deep. And they need constant maintenance because they're getting attacked by salt water all of the time. So they need constant welding, and they need pieces to be swapped out. So these divers are basically construction workers.
Right.
but they're also expert divers, and a lot of them are ex Navy clearance divers, so a lot of them are ex-military.
So, is this a high paid job? I mean, I assume there's some sort of, I'm not even sure adrenaline rush would pertain here, but possibly it is. But what else? What's the other reward for actually choosing to do this?
I think it takes a particular type of person, and I talk about this a lot in the book. 3 hots and a cot, 3 hot meals and a bed, and a simple life. So it takes a certain kind of psychology, and a lot of the people who want to do it are military people because they like that feeling of having a straightforward life and having camaraderie, having people, having that real team ethic in a dangerous situation. But yeah, they're really well paid. They're paid kind of 5 to 10 times more than a construction worker on land would be. So they get very well paid. So a lot of the sat divers that I looked into, they, especially in the 70s and 80s when it was even more dangerous, they would have a Rolls Royce or a Ferrari and they were out welding, but they were well compensated for the risk they were taking and for the discomfort. And then often, because they're kind of an outlaw group of people living on the edge of society where nobody really knows what they're doing, they get paid very well. A lot of them were terrible with money because they felt they needed a reward for that 28-day shift. So they would come on shore and just blow all of that money. So they're very wild, fun characters. They're like the opposite of authors, I think.
Well, I mean, it's been true for, centuries that sailors have a tendency, and getting off ship to blow whatever it is on, let's say they've landed in like Hong Kong or somewhere and, they're out on the town and often lose their money, whatever it all is. When you said that, it reminded me that there are examples of people who've, served time in prison. And when they're let loose in the world, they don't function because that structure, 3 hots and a cot that they got in prison, it's really not that different if you think about it. You in a prison cell, being in this diving chamber, you actually have more better hygiene and whatever it is in prison. The only difference is that you don't get to choose, when you can exit. Although if you sign up for a 28-day dive, then there you are. Is there any, what would you do if there was any kind of emergency? You just have to, family emergency. Would you even know? Would they even tell somebody?
This is really disturbing, actually. In real life, this has happened, and sometimes they'll tell the diver, and they start decompression immediately so that diver can get out 4 days later. But oftentimes the other divers, who are all medically qualified to some extent, they're all kind of emergency medics, often they have to sedate that diver against their will. This happens, it doesn't happen frequently, but there's plenty of recorded instances of divers needing to be sedated, and they have access, these divers in the chamber have access to really serious pain relief and opiates, because what is really common is for these divers to lose fingers and toes and even hands and feet. And then if that happens, the other divers have to deal with that. They can't suddenly get this person to an ambulance. These other divers have to sew them up. So they have access to really much more powerful meds than you would expect them to.
Wow, I wonder if that's a draw. Maybe it is. Right. So we have 6 people who are locked inside a hyperbaric chamber, and they are in the North Sea in this book, right?
That's right. They're a mixture of Americans and Brits, because often each system is linked together in terms of language. So English speakers will go in one saturation system, and then Italians will go in another. It's a very global industry, but they're grouped together in terms of how they can communicate with each other.
So you must have done astonishing amounts of research to write this book. I mean, it's not anything you would naturally know living in the woods in Sweden.
Shocking amount of research. Yeah, I researched solidly for kind of 6 months for this book, solidly. And I think 90 to 95% of that research didn't make it into the book, but I needed to know it to kind of understand what should go into the book. But some stories were even too horrific to go in the book. There's this term raspberry jam that the divers in real life use, because these guys live in such extreme circumstances. They have very dark humor. in the same way as special forces soldiers do, or doctors and nurses have to, paramedics do. And raspberry jam basically means a diver who has been, for whatever reason, it doesn't exist anymore. So there's one situation where a Russian diver had his huge helmet on, 20-kilo metal helmet with his light, and he was standing on a grill on the seabed, and they were joining together two pieces of pipeline, and they got the pressure wrong. So there was a differential DP, which means there was a differential in pressure they didn't expect, and this poor man was pulled through the grill, through this grating, and all that was left was the helmet sitting on top of the grating.
Oh my God. Wow.
So it's amazing what they have to deal with. And I wanted this book to be about trust and how they can trust each other, or how they have to trust each other, but also about staying calm when other people would panic.
So in my experience so far with people who write books that are, full of stuff that the normal person wouldn't know, it's always interesting how people in that profession will talk to a writer. They might not talk to a reporter. They might not, if I showed up, at the dock or whatever it is, they might not talk to me, but somehow or other, writers seem to have some sort of magnetism, or maybe people just want to tell their stories. What do you think it is? Because obviously a lot of people talk to you.
I think they probably feel sorry for us. That's probably what it is. But no, I didn't talk to any saturation divers because there are so few of them, and they're at the bottom of the sea. But I did talk to commercial divers. So these people know saturation divers, and they're going to become saturation divers. And I also talked to Royal Navy clearance divers. And those divers are saturation divers, but they imagine doing that job, but operating in a war zone. So some of them were working in the Falkland Islands conflict. So they were at the bottom of the sea, dealing with an unexploded bomb on a ship, dealing with all of those problems of breathing gas in a hot war with an unexploded. I just can't. My life is so boring here in the woods compared to these people. So I am kind of flabbergasted how they stay calm. There's a saying in saturation diving, you can't get ahead of your hat, which means you can't start breathing too quickly. You need to stay calm. And dive supervisors who talk to the divers whilst they're working on the seabed will often say, "Take a minute for yourself, diver." And that's when they can tell that diver is starting to lose control. Right. And it just means put your tools down and just rest for 5 minutes. And there are actual instances where divers have lost their minds down on the seabed, and really experienced professionals have just taken off their helmet at the bottom of the sea. They, for whatever reason, they lost control. And in those circumstances, obviously it's horrific for the diver and for the family, but it's also horrific for the supervisor who's talking to this person, this diver, and trying to talk them down, trying to calm them down, and failing. So there's a lot of psychological distress, I think, on both sides, from the supervisor side and the divers.
I remember years ago going to tour the German submarine that was tugged down through the St. Lawrence Seaway in Lake Michigan and came to rest in Chicago outside the Museum of Science and Industry. And it's sort of like, an extended tuna can or something to go in it, but they allow you to go in it. And lots of the conversation there is about all the testing they tried to do with the Navy personnel that they were going to send off in these little, this is World War II when, submarine technology and all wasn't all that advanced. And they were going to spend a lot of time underwater, and people were going to be shooting torpedoes at them, and, it was going to be horrible. And they did an enormous amount of testing to determine, which people could do that. So, yours is sort of analogous, but maybe even a step more difficult. Although I don't know, if I were down there in a submarine and I knew that torpedoes were coming at me, I might find it harder to stay calm than in the situation you're describing.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're all incredibly brave. Yeah, I can't get my head around it. I mean, the fact that they have to trust each other, but after a certain point, for example, in this book, once they start dying one by one, how do you trust each other at that point? And how do you trust the people outside feeding you gas mixes, feeding you, literally giving you food through the hatch? You can't trust anyone. And then at a certain point, if you haven't slept for 2 or 3 days and you haven't eaten and you're breathing this gas and it's very hot and close, you can't leave, can you trust yourself as well?
Right. So we have 6 saturation divers now that we painted a picture of what that means and who they are and where they are. And there they are down inside their hyperbaric chamber, heading towards, they are in fact towards the bottom of the sea. And then one of them is found dead in his bunk. So that means 6 people are now reduced to 5 living people and a corpse.
Yeah, and that idea of having to, as a society, we always distance ourselves from the dead, and we have all these traditions that vary from culture to culture about how we deal respectfully with the dead, and we try and have some kind of separation between ourselves and the dead. And to have to be in this close, humid chamber with a corpse who you were laughing and joking with 24 hours before is psychologically very taxing. And then other things happen, which I can't even get into, but they have to also, for example, they have to take some blood samples and various different samples from the corpse. And that's just a horrendous thing to have to do when you can't step away from that situation. Normally, if you're a professional and you do that, you're gloved, you're masked, and then you can leave the room. But having to stay with that person who you've worked with maybe for years is just horrific, I think.
So finding this person dead and nobody knows what the cause is, hence the blood samples, another thing. Does that trigger off going up and then those days of decompression because they can't just rise to the surface and step out? So, there's no way to dispose of the corpse. In other words, remember in, all the old seafaring yards and somebody died aboard, a wooden sailing ship or something, and they sewed them into a shroud and off over the side they went. There's some speculation that cruise ships used to do that for a while, but now my understanding is that in the event that somebody actually died there, they're refrigerated until the cruise ship can get to port. Because there are a lot of old people that take cruises, and you never. I think Victoria Holt died at sea. Do you remember ever reading Victoria Holt, who wrote under 2 other names? She wrote as Philippa Carr. She wrote as Victoria Holt, and I think she had one other name. But anyway, she loved, and as I remember it, she actually died at sea on a cruise, but I can't remember.
Well, this subject, I had to do an uncomfortable amount of research into this for the last one. And you're absolutely right. On the Pacific leg of a cruise, there's on average more than one person in the freezer of a cruise ship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think they're no longer allowed to just throw them into international waters, which used to be, the deal. Well, I'm sure there are all kinds of reasons why bringing them home to port, and think how awful for any companion, to know that whoever you were with, had died and was downstairs in the food locker. But still, that would be superior to the scene that you're describing here, where 5 of them are now in this barrier. I mean, this chamber. And
yeah, and exactly. And the chamber is on the ship, so the chamber is always at sea level, actually, and then they go up and down in a diving bell.
Right. Okay.
So they're up on sea level, but they can see through the porthole people walking about, walking onto deck, going into the dive control room, and they can never get to that help. So they're interviewed by a police detective through the porthole, and they know that detective can never help them. Nobody can help them. And when the second diver dies, they realize, this wasn't an accident. This is actually a crime. Something is going on here. But they don't know the source of it. They don't know if it's someone on the inside or someone on the outside.
Absolutely true. The first person could have died for some medical reason, but if you reject coincidence, the fact that a second apparently healthy person would die argues that something is going on, and that's as far as we're going to go when talking about it. But I will say, Will, that I did think that your solution was ingenious.
Well, that means a lot coming from you, so thank you very much. I'm never 100% sure of the ending when I start a novel. I have an idea of it, a vague image of the scene, but the way the tension built up, I wanted it to be very Hitchcockian and the chess game towards the end, and I wanted that. Yeah, I was satisfied with the ending, and I'm glad that I left enough room that I could be a little fluid with it as well.
Yep, you could. I wish we could talk to you more about Ellen, who's kind of a point of view character here, and her personal story. Her is a very interesting one, but I don't want to do any spoilers about it. But again, I thought that you did that really well as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted her to be very relatable, and as all of us are, complicated with a complicated past. And it's that similar dynamic to astronauts. It's difficult to have a complicated past if you're an astronaut or if you're a saturation diver, because everybody needs to know that you're completely reliable and completely calm. And often astronauts and saturation divers are compared, and saturation divers will say, well, yeah, they're very similar, but actually if you get a leak in the International Space Station, you got time to patch it. If you get a leak in a saturation chamber, everyone dies instantly, and probably a couple of people outside the chamber will die as well. But not only that, when you're working outside on a spacewalk, you have perfect visibility and no friction. Whereas if you're working at the bottom of the sea, often you can't see in front of your own face because of the amount of sand picking up. And you have something else to contend with, which is that if you're on the International Space Station fixing something on a spacewalk, you don't suddenly feel a huge living thing brush past your legs.
Hopefully.
We're
fairly sure that's true.
Yeah, that's a whole different genre. Yeah.
Well, yes, but I mean, bottom line is that these are human beings scaled to work on, on Earth, on the ground, who are in completely hostile environments where without artificial support, they can't sustain life. And death will actually be probably almost instantaneous.
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah. I mean, I did think that, you're right, that going down is not that much different than going up, towards Mars. I don't know if what is her book called? I'm having a blank here. What's one of my senior moments about the British author, Natasha Pullum. Is that her name? I think it is. Natasha or Natalia Pullum.
Yeah, that rings a bell. Yeah.
Right. Anyway, she wrote a phenomenal book that we talked about, we debuted last spring, about Earth colony on Mars. And she did a job very similar to yours in the way that she figured out, what that would be like and the challenges. And the thing on Mars that was the most difficult was gravity, because the gravity thing is different in how artificial aids and so forth tried to help humans adjust to the difference in gravity. And if they couldn't, it too would be fatal. But because Earth was dying, there was an impetus for all these people to go to Mars, because staying home was not really going to be an option. And, if we're listening to Elon Musk, we might think that this is actually not really speculative fiction, but, but there we are. Right. So what's coming up for you next? And thank you. Patrick is saving me again. Natasha Pulley, and the book is called The Mars House. Boy, do I recommend it. I thought it's a complicated, very long read. It has a love story, but it has a dynamic quite similar to this one, although it's not a locked room mystery, and it's not And Then There Were None. It's different in that sense. But I think it's amazing the way writers can take us to places that they are only, well, in your case, not imagining it, but sort of imagining it because you haven't done it yourself.
Yeah, I will definitely look up that book. That sounds fascinating. And I do like the space undersea comparison. In the last one, my protagonist was called Kaz Ripley. And in The Chamber, my protagonist is Ellen Brooke. And if you put those two names together, you get Ellen Ripley from the Alien film.
Wow, there's an Easter egg from the author. Love that. Right. Writers have fun doing things, these little games that probably not everyone who reads the books will figure out, but very satisfying, isn't it?
It is. It is. We spend so much time alone with our manuscripts that it's nice to be playful sometimes.
You bet. So I have not said that Chris, sorry, not Chris. Why am I having Will? Will is the author of The Last One, Firstborn, The Last Thing to Burn, and he's been nominated for and had lots of acclaim for his work. His first book, Dark Pines, was selected as a book club on ITV and shortlisted for the National Book Award, the British one, and the Guardian's Not the Booker Prize. I didn't even know there was a Not the Booker Prize. What fun. Tell me about that.
I don't know. I can't remember much about it. That was back in 2018, but it was run by The Guardian, and it was just an alternative to the Booker Prize, I think. And it always brought up some interesting titles. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, the Booker Prize is, a much lauded literary award and sort of famous for being for books that few people ever actually read. So not the Booker Prize might be might be the antithesis in the sense of saying, these are books you really want to read.
Maybe, yeah. It definitely brought out some interesting titles and some slightly more commercial fiction as well.
Absolutely. So, with all that behind you, what are you working on next? Because, it takes so long to get a book from the time it's completed into publication that generally the author is either written or is, coming towards concluding another book. So, what's up for you?
So, my books take about 3 to 5 years from idea to publication. So I've got a lot in the pipeline that's coming up. But my book next year is it's kind of Sleeping with the Enemy meets Shutter Island.
Ooh.
It's very psychological, and it's about relationships and family, and it's also very claustrophobic. But it's about a family of writers. I can't say much more about it right now, but it's very emotional. It's kind of similar to The Last Thing to Burn in that kind of extremely tense emotional feel.
And what about your much praised series character? Is she going to be showing up again?
She is. The next book is called Ice Town, and it will be out in November in the US and in the UK.
This year?
This year.
Well, tell us a little more about her for people who haven't read her.
So Tuva Moodyson is a young deaf journalist working in small town Sweden, and these books are very kind of Twin Peaks or Fargo-esque. They're very quirky murder mysteries that are quite dark and set in a very, very dark, cold place in Sweden. And they're in development right now to be made into a TV series.
Ooh.
Which is exciting. And so is The Last One is also in development right now. So I'm spending a lot of time with those as well.
That's very exciting. So in the place where you have, I'm going to be redundant there, the location that you have given her, where would it be if you were imagining it in Sweden?
It's in central Sweden, in Värmland, which is really I don't know what the equivalent in the US would be, probably Alaska, actually. Just somewhere extremely wild with a lot of bears and wolves and moose and very few people. And Tuva describes it as being at the edge of the map. It's very much like there's not much help up there. There's a small town with one bar, one supermarket, and one hotel, and like 2 police officers. And she's the only full-time reporter. And so she knows everybody in this town. And the recurring characters are a lot of fun. It's very Twin Peaks, I would say. And I wrote it before I watched Twin Peaks, but since when Dark Pines came out, everybody said this brings me straight back to Twin Peaks, and I'd never watched it. And then I immediately bought the DVD and loved it.
How wonderful. So my experience with Sweden, I've had several experiences with Sweden, but the one that took me the farthest north, I think I might have told you this. There's a company in Britain that organizes railway trips. They go all over. Almost all Brits that sign up to go on them. That's their customer base. But we have a couple that we have traveled with, and they were really excited about doing this trip. So we're the 4 Americans in a otherwise group of British travelers, and we fly to Stockholm, and we have a great time in Stockholm, which one of my favorite cities. love the Gamlastan, love, I like going up and cruising up towards the islands and, the Opera House and all that fun stuff up there. Anyway, and then we took a train and we went north and we ended up in Lapland. And because even though it was June, there was still so much snow, we had to abandon the train for a bus, which was great because the reindeer were on the road. And if we'd been on the train, we wouldn't have had all this reindeer contact. But and some of the train enthusiasts, because they tend to be, kind of geeky about trains, they were really cross that they weren't on the train. We're all going, yay, it's reindeer, whatever. But anyway, so we wound up spending time in Lapland and then crossed over. There's a little 2 trains, I think it is, that take you to Narvik, Norway, which is the place in Norway that was the farthest north, if I remember this right, that the Nazis took control.
Yeah.
And beautiful place, lots of mountains. Unfortunately, the cable car was it was such a windy day, they closed the cable car. We couldn't do that. And then you get to descend through Norway. But I thought Lapland was completely fascinating. I wish that we had more than a couple of days there. So you're somewhere between Lapland and Stockholm is, I guess, what I'm saying. I'm trying to get too geographic.
Yeah, exactly that. Halfway between, normally with Tuva, but this book in Icetown is set in the far north, in the mountains, so close to Lapland. And the town is fictional, but it's twinned with Whittier in Alaska, this little town, this real town in Alaska, where you can only access it via a tunnel.
Yes, there's in fact a very good debut novel that was published 2 or 3 years ago, set in Whittier, and the whole thing depends upon the fact it is sort of a version really of And Then There Were None. You can only get to it by going through the tunnel in the winter. So, or anytime, but in the winter, you could do great things with it. So it's fascinating, very much a remote community. But anyway, let's see, Sunday night, we did Brad Thor's book lunch, and his book, Shadow of Doubt, takes place in Norway, but also requires somebody from Russia to cross over to Norway atop Finland and Sweden. And then last night, we did the book lunch for James Rollins and Archangel, and the same geography comes into play, except that you go down to Archangel and Murmansk. And what I reminded the audience, because a lot of people are not really familiar with geography, is that neither Sweden nor Norway goes all the way, or Finland. Norway arcs across the very top. So however far north you go in Sweden, you're still not as far north as the far north of Norway, just because it works that way. And I find that fascinating.
That's very true. It is fascinating. And it's kind of a very desolate, quiet, extremely northern area, which hasn't really been in the news for decades. And then suddenly now it's a real hot spot. And that border is suddenly a hot border again. It's an interesting border.
Very hot border, especially since Finland is, building a wall, so to speak, too. And I gather, and I can't remember the name specifically of the town, but Brad went to all the trouble to, write about the real crossing place where the Russian defector goes across to Norway. And, I've been to Murmansk, not a place I would recommend you touring, but it just happened that we worked out there. And I've been to Archangel as well. I call it Archangel, but it's Archangelsk, I think now, in a Russian oblast. And they were World War II important ports, but they are now becoming more and more ice-free. And there's trade routes are moving north so that you can actually travel, let's say, from Hong Kong up and across the top of Russia and come down. It's going to change so many things.
Mm-hmm. It is
amazing. But Norway is going to be much more of a hotspot than one would imagine, because it is that border across Finland. And so in your experience, did the Swedes and the Norwegians, maybe now more so the Finns, cooperate in all this? Because that corridor is going to affect all 3 countries.
Very much they coordinate. Yeah, they're all the best of friends. There's a real kind of sense of brotherhood in Scandinavia. And they have to be, because their populations are so small in each country. So there's that sense of cooperation. which has built up ever since World War II. You know, in World War II, the Norwegians were very brave, the Finns were very incredibly brave, and the Swedes kind of kept out of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, there's been a lot more cooperation. And now, especially with Sweden joining NATO, there's a lot of, yeah, I think I have friends in Sweden now who are volunteering for the military at my age. And there's a sense that everyone has to kind of pull together.
Right. Well, all three countries belong to NATO now.
Yeah.
But I can remember cruising the Baltic. Gosh, it was like 2005 or something. And if you really pay attention, you could see that the conflicts between those countries and Denmark and Russia, it was like, you know, kept the alliances would keep shifting. I mean, Sweden was the major power in the 16th century, and you can go to the Vasa Museum and, you know, see Sweden, you know, trying to take the lead in shipbuilding, and didn't work out too well with the Vasa, but, you know, in general. And, you know, and now I find it really interesting that despite all that, you know, centuries of history when they didn't all cooperate, right now it's a bloc, right, within NATO.
It really is, yeah. There's that whole thing of the enemy of your enemy is your friend. Like, you have to come together, and they have a lot in common, these different countries. They tease each other a little bit, like the Brits and the French. Kind of, they get on, they're very close, but they also tease each other. If a Swede sees somebody going around a roundabout more than once, they'll say they're driving like a Norwegian. So
Love that. Right. And of course, Sweden is linked directly to Denmark by a bridge, you know, which has come into play. What was the name of that wonderful writer who was down there in the city at the very far south of Sweden? He was like one of the first Scandi noir writers. And one of his books, in fact, depended upon the bridge crossing back and forth. Well, anyway,
yeah.
if I could remember names, I would be so much better off, and so would everybody listening to me. But there we are. Patrick, come and join us and tell us if any questions have arisen.
Are you talking about Henning Mankell, Barbara?
I am, exactly. And Ystad is, I think, is the city down there at the bottom. Although I can't speak Swedish, and even though I think, you know, phonetically, it looks like you could say it. In Sweden, it's just a whole. Do you speak Swedish by now?
I speak some Swedish, and I think you did very well there with Ystad. It's which is a very nice place, and it's beautiful down there. The area is called Skåne, and yeah, Henrik Mankell wrote very well about that area.
He really did. He was wonderful. Right. So, Patrick.
Yeah, no, this has been a fascinating discussion. There are a number of questions that have come in, but one thing I wanted to ask you about is, I'm sure you're aware of that horrible submarine tragedy that happened fairly recently. What exactly happened in that case? Did the submarine implode, or are you familiar with that story?
I'm definitely not qualified to talk about that, but I would say that it was very different from the world of saturation diving, partly because these were not professional divers, and they were breathing air, I think, and they were just in a pressurized small sub. But from my understanding, it probably imploded, and it's just shocking that they were using kind of a PlayStation controller to pilot this thing. Astonishing. But that's really the opposite of saturation diving. There are so many safety controls in place in saturation diving that the actual sat divers think it's extremely safe. Even though I'm terrified of it, they'll say that the people who came before in the 70s and 80s were very brave. And some of the very early saturation diving stories were similar to that incident, in that there wasn't really any health and safety. There weren't really any safeguards in place, but now it's incredibly safe.
Yeah, I think that the type of story you're telling really taps into some deep universal fears that we have, you know. Some of the questions that have come in.
Can I just mention exactly what you just said? There's this some of the saturation divers, they have a saying that the surface is not your friend. Your surface is no help. Because if you're 100 meters down and something goes wrong, our human instinct is to surge up to the surface, and that will kill these divers instantly. So that feeling that if you're in the bottom of the sea and you can't go up, the only way you can get help is to go back to your diving bell. You cannot go to the surface, is horrifying, I think.
On a much smaller scale, you hear about the, surfers, professional surfers talk about getting in the washing machine, where they lose all sense of which way's up and which way's down. God, that's terrifying. But some of the questions that have come in, are you claustrophobic yourself?
I don't think I am, actually. No, my wife is, and she's my first reader, so I feel terrible to put her through these books. I feel quite guilty. But she's claustrophobic, but she always says it's kind of similar to riding a roller coaster. She likes the fact that she has that sensation of terror, but she knows she's in a safe place on the sofa reading a book. So I think this is an okay book for claustrophobic people, I think, if she can read it. But no, I'm not particularly claustrophobic. What I am terrified of is being out of control or being controlled by other people. And I think that's what I'm writing about over and over again, is that sense of not being in control of your own destiny.
Right. Let's see. Oh, here's a question, and you may have discussed this briefly. Why did you decide to move to Sweden?
That's a good question. So I'm from the East Midlands in the UK, which is the equivalent of Iowa or somewhere like that. And I moved to London when I was 18, first person in my family to go to college. And then I stayed in London for 15 years. We stayed in a small one-bedroom apartment. London is extremely expensive. And I wanted to grow potatoes and have a big dog. So I wanted to live in the countryside, and my wife is Swedish. So we said, why not try Sweden, and why not try and live in the wilderness, actually, one step further. And we found a little swampy piece of land in the middle of a forest. And we flew over and we built a cabin. It took a few years. And now we've been here for 12 years full time. So I chop wood for heating and cooking and hot water. We have a big St. Bernard, and it's a very, very quiet place to read and write. And I always love being here, and then I love leaving as well, to go to London and go to the States and to go to France to do events. And when I fly over the North Sea now, I always look out of the window on the plane and look down at that huge canvas of ocean. And I think about the kind of dozen or so people who are down there working. As I'm flying, having a drink, reading a book, they're down there right now working 24-hour shifts. And I always kind of take a moment just to kind of almost thank them for doing that job.
In a digital world, no matter where you are, you can stay connected too. So, century ago, if you were living in your little marshy part of Sweden, you would have been isolated. But now, we're having this conversation, right?
Absolutely true. Yeah. When we decided to move here, our friends' parents were horrified because they remember how tough it was living in this kind of remote place 50 years ago. But now we have, like you say, we have 5G mobile broadband, we have a 4-wheel drive truck, and it's not that difficult. It's actually not that difficult. The only time when it is difficult is when it's minus 30 Celsius and it's very, very dark in the wintertime. And then you can feel very remote. Like, we can't get fire trucks into us because we're so remote. We can't get the police to come to us or an ambulance. So we have to be a bit more self-reliant than we did in London. But it feels very safe. I feel very safe being surrounded by trees.
How close is your closest neighbor?
It's not that far in, by the standards of North America, it's not that far. So we've got a store that's like a 45-minute drive away, and the nearest neighbors, who are also very rural, are not that, like a few miles through the forest. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah.
How far away is the closest, major city?
It's like an hour away, and that's the same with the airport. No, it's not bad at all. So I travel like every 3 or 4 weeks. I'm on a plane.
Wow.
Yeah.
If you lived in Denver, the airport would be roughly as far away. So, although they've improved it with a rail transfer, but when they first opened the Denver airport, it was roughly an hour drive, to Toronto airport is way out there. So really, in terms of airports, yours is not that, but it must feed into Stockholm. You must not be able to just get on the plane and go, to Venice or something.
No, that's very true. The the airport is quite rural. It's
Right.
quite local. So I can fly to London directly if
You
it's on the right day.
can.
Yeah, I can fly to London, but I can't fly. Like when I fly to the States, I have to go via Amsterdam or via London.
I'm amazed that you could fly nonstop to London. That's really impressive.
Well, we're quite close to the Volvo headquarters. I think that's the only reason why.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay. Now, there we go. I'm
They
sure
even
they're.
have a they even have a racetrack that goes through the forest to test their cars. Yeah.
Oh, my husband has a Volvo, and when we watch television, and especially MHZ TV, which is our favorite TV channel because it's foreign, various foreign shows and so forth, and many of them in translation. Every time he sees a Volvo, he goes, Volvo. It's great.
Yeah, the Swedes are very proud of their Volvos. Yeah.
They are.
And ABBA.
Yes.
Yeah. Wanted to ask you a little bit about the point of view that you know adopted for this book. I imagine it. How did you center upon the best way to tell the story? Because it starts with first person, and then you adopt this very interesting kind of we voice as well. Can you talk about that?
It all comes down to, I think, when I have a idea, I'm a very visual person, so I see a setting and I see a character in a particular setting. So with the last one, I saw a woman on a cruise ship, and the cruise ship was empty, and she was running away from my point of view, and I wanted to know what she was running away from. And with the chamber, I saw this little hatch window, and I saw a face. I saw her eyes, and I wanted to know what was going on inside there, inside the chamber, but also inside her own head. I don't really, it's not a conscious effort for me. A lot of writers are very clever, and they will come to a story idea quite strategically and write CVs, write resumes for their characters, and they'll know what they've all done in the past, and they'll have a really clear idea of the story before they start. And for me, that takes a little of the fun away. So I like to have a feel for the character, but without writing anything down. And with Ellen, I had a really clear sense of what she had gone through and how determined she was to be just as good as the other guys that she was diving with. So yeah, it's not something I consciously decide. It's more something that comes to me. That sounds quite weird, but it's the way it is. Yeah.
No, everybody's creative process is different. I mean, Patrick and I talk to hundreds of authors a year, and there really is no right answer to how writers go about doing things. I often wonder when the audience, because fans almost invariably, don't they, Patrick, at an event, ask about writing process, and I'm never entirely sure whether they think it's because it's transferable. Therefore, maybe they could do it, or whether it's just, just interesting. What's your sense of that, Patrick?
It's a great question. I mean, you wonder if there's this sense of magic about it in a lot of people's minds, that there's this sort of mystical process, and you're right, every writer's different, and there's not, is it transferable to them? I don't know. It's a good question.
Well, I mean, certain basics maybe, but I think everyone has to develop his or her own creative process. I mean, the whole thing about publishing that makes it in some ways perfectly absurd is that it's an attempt to marry a creative process with business. And, I mean, they're so wildly antithetical. To try to make any kind of coherent whole of it is extremely difficult. It's also true, I might say, of bookselling. It's not just publishing that has this difficulty, But I think that's why it fascinates people. I mean, people who are in it, like us, like, Patrick and I have been doing this together for over 30 years. And there's a sort of inherent fascination in these conversations and exploring, how is it that people are creative, and how do they marry that to business? You're a professional writer. So, if you're a professional writer, then there's an income stream that flows to you and, sustains your lifestyle. And so you have to be cognizant, not just of the creative process, but also the business side.
That's true. And that's one good thing about living in the forest, is when I'm in the forest, it's very much the creative side. So I can really shut out the business side and focus on the storytelling and focus on my craft and focus on reading. And then when I travel, which I do so often, then I'm more the business side, and I'm doing events and I'm meeting my agent, meeting my publishers, meeting with TV producers, and that's the business side. So I can shut out both things. I never write when I'm on the road. I never write when I'm traveling, and I never really bring the business stuff to Sweden. When I'm just about to start writing a first draft now, and I'm fascinated by other writers' processes still, and I'm still not entirely sure how we do this thing. For me, it's a real confidence trick. It's so terrifying. I've written 10 books now, but it's still terrifying, the idea of a blank screen and that first sentence and the best way into a story. And the story I'm about to write, I've been thinking about so much for the last 6 months to a year, but it's still terrifying, that first sentence, to set the tone. That first time you write, that point of view character's voice has to be right. So I find myself Googling things like how to write a novel still.
You're going to have many surprises in store when your stories are translated to a visual presentation. And it'll affect your life in lots of different ways, should the TV or the film, whatever it is, go forward and be successful.
It's going to be really interesting. I really feel like a beginner in that process. I'm executive producer on those projects as well, so I'm involved, but I know nothing, so I defer to the experts. But it's really interesting and a real privilege to be involved at the start.
I'm sure it is, but I also would think to see your work actually transferred to actors and people watching it would be, I've always thought that would be a really interesting thing for a writer, because then the actor really becomes the point of view character and they bring their own stuff to it. And it may not really be entirely what you had in mind. And so how do you reconcile yourself to all that? I think the answer is that the books are still the books. That's the answer we get from the people that have been through that process, is they have to remember that whatever happens on the screen, the book is still a book.
So true. And at this point in my career, I'm used to giving up a little control along the way. I'm used to the collaborative effort. I'm used to an audiobook narrator narrating in a voice that doesn't quite fit the voice that I have in my head of that protagonist. So I'm used to that. So I think we have to be flexible. And generally, I'm just very excited about the whole process of seeing them on screen. A little bit terrified, but mainly very excited.
I can imagine. Right. So Patrick, one last question, or are we done?
Let's see. Did you mention at the beginning of the program, have you had a short hyperbaric chamber training of any sort?
No, and I never will, having written this book. There's no way. You can't really do, you can do bits and pieces as a civilian, but you can't really do anything to the same extent as the professionals do. And no, I could not think of anything worse than being stuck in a little chamber and having it pressurized and not being able to leave. No, I never will. No, I think it's the kind of thing where you can use your imagination plus research to get this to the same point.
Stuck with a stack of legal pads, right, and a pen. See what you came up with.
I think it would turn into The Shining. I would just be repeating the same phrase over and over.
Right.
Well, thank you, Will. It's lovely to spend an hour with you. I always look forward to this as kind of a highlight of the summer, and maybe one of these, well, I know that you isolate yourself from the literary community when you're at home, but in people in Arizona go to Sweden in the summer. So should I chance to do that, maybe I can lure you out of the forest long enough for a drink or something. We'll find out. But in the meantime, let us recommend The Chamber to you. It's out in paperback here in the US. And then Patrick has already showed you that from our London partner bookstore, we have some autographed copies in the UK hardcover. So you can take your pick. Right. So thanks very much. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to see you.
Thank you.